Thank you for downloading this podcast from Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk. For more podcasts and more information on your number one news and talk station, please visit 702.co.za or capetalk.co.za.
Stand up for the law. Stand up for decency. Stand up for compassion. Stand up for respect. Stand up for your community. Stand up for your future. Stand up for South Africa. LeadSA.co.za.
The Naked Scientist on Talk Radio 702 and 567 Cape Talk with Reedy Clubby.
It is 27 minutes to 10 o'clock and let's welcome Chris. Good morning, Chris.
Morning, Reedy.
Are you well today?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
Okay, lovely to have you with us. I understand you have a story for us about radio cells. What's that about?
Oh, this is radio-controlled cells.
Okay.
But before I go on, can I ask a favour?
Yes, of course.
I'm getting myself back very loudly. That's better. Thank you very much.
That's better, okay.
Okay, here we go. So there is a paper this week, and it is by researchers at the Rockefeller University. This is Sarah Stanley in New York. It's published in the journal Science, and what these researchers have been able to do is to make cells effectively radio-controlled. In other words, you can make them respond to radio signals by changing their biochemistry. So here's how they did it. They started with a little temperature-sensing molecule called TRP, TRPV1, which you find on nerve cells. It's how you tell what temperature your bath water is, for example. When you put your hand in the warm water, this little molecule changes its activity, and it passes that change in activity onto the nerve cell, and you can work out the temperature. So they started with that molecule. They added to the surface of it a little chemical tag, and they then added a whole bunch of iron nanoparticles, which are just tiny fragments of iron oxide, to which they had linked an antibody that recognized this tag on this molecule, so that when you sprinkled these iron nanoparticles on cells that were making this TRP molecule, the nanoparticles would stick to the temperature-sensing molecule. Now, the reason for doing this is that the iron nanoparticles absorb radio waves, and when they absorb radio waves, and in this case they're absorbing radio waves at about 465 kilohertz, so quite low frequency radio waves, they warm up. And what the researchers were able to show is that when they zapped cells in the dish with these radio waves, they were able to warm the sensor up by about 1 degree C, and this made it change its activity, and this made the cell change activity. And they then went a step further, because when these channels become active, they let calcium go into the cell. So they said, well, if we've got calcium going into the cell, can we make the calcium do something? So they made a little sequence of DNA that had a whole bunch of sequences which are called calcium response elements. They're like genetic switches that can detect when calcium levels go up or down. And they linked that to the insulin gene. And by zapping the cells with radio waves, they were then able to turn on expression of insulin in these cells, the chemical that controls blood sugar. And then they go a bigger step further, which is they put clusters of these cells into mice, and they then beam the radio waves into the mice, and they can see the mouse glucose levels going up and down with the radio wave signals. So what they've effectively done is to enable us to control from outside the body the biochemical activity of cells inside the body. And it's really striking and a big step forward, this, because up until now people have tried to do this with chemicals that detect visible light, but of course visible light and even infrared light can only penetrate a short distance into tissue. Radio waves will pass right through tissue, and they will also do it harmlessly. So this is a really big step forward and a great way in the future of controlling tissues deep inside bodies, potentially.
All right, our lines are open for you. Whatever it is that you want to ask the Naked Scientist this morning, do give us a call on 021-446-0567, 011-883-0702. Let's go to Anne. Anne, you are calling us from Centurion. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Reedy. Good morning, Chris. A quick one. As you get older, I know your skin loses its elasticity, right? So when when you go around corners, you're working in the garden or anywhere, you knock your skin, and then I think to myself, oh, Anne, not another blue mark. And you get a blue mark, but it disappears in maybe about 3 or 4, 7 days' time. Why is that? Because sometimes I really knock myself and I think, oh, look at the blue marks. Why is it? And I've been told it's a sign of your blood being thin. And I reckon, no, I don't think so. Can Chris help me out there?
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Anne.
I listen on the radio.
Lovely.
Okay. Good question. Well, what you're doing, of course, is bruising yourself. So you need to be more careful. But when you bruise yourself, you are injuring blood vessels. If you injure blood vessels, then they leak a little bit, and blood comes out into the tissue. When blood is in your blood vessels, it contains a relatively high amount of oxygen. And when the blood is oxygenated, it is a brighter red colour than when it is deoxygenated. It loses oxygen. So once the blood leaves the blood vessel, tissue around the blood starts to consume the oxygen from it, and hemoglobin goes a darker and darker colour as it loses its oxygen. So the blood that's in the bruise darkens partly because the hemoglobin has been deoxygenated and it looks a blue colour. So that's the first purpley blue hue that you get when you bruise yourself. And then the subsequent colour changes that happen in a bruise, you're almost doing chromatography experiments in your skin, because the immune system comes in and macrophages, these big eating up cells, break down the blood that exited the blood vessel, and they oxidise or reduce various chemicals as they break open the hemoglobin molecules and release the iron and that kind of thing. And the products of those breakdown reactions are greeny yellow colours, because they're biliverdin and bilirubin, and they then spread out in the tissue, and that's why the bruise changes colour. The reason you probably bruise more readily as you get older is because your skin gets thinner, and as Anne says, you lose some of the elastic tissue, the elastin, and also the collagen. And thinner skin means that when you put energy into the skin from a knock or a scrape, you've got fewer areas in the skin to dissipate the energy, because you've got thinner skin, and therefore it's like having smaller buffers or a smaller buffer zone to absorb the shock or the impact. So more of the energy is more likely to be transmitted to small blood vessels and cause them to bleed. Also, older people may put themselves on low doses of aspirin or be given aspirin by their doctor because they are at risk of, say, a stroke or a heart attack, and aspirin also reduces the clotting ability of blood, and so you're more likely to bruise more easily if you take aspirin, and that may be the reason.
Let's go to Judy in Midrand. Good morning.
Hi, Chris. I've just come back from Spain, and I noticed that some windmills turn clockwise and others turn anti-clockwise. Is there any reason for that?
Okay.
Is this wind turbines or the kind of windmills that grind up flour, Julie?
The wind turbine, the actual turbine.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any reason why they have to go one way or the other, apart from just the convention and the engineering. If you look at the shape of the blades, the way a turbine works is that the blades present a leading surface into the wind, and as the air hits that, it's got two options. It can either bounce back the way it's come, which is obviously daft, or it can flow across the blade, sticking to the curved surface by the Coanda effect. And if you make the air what the blade is doing is pushing the air to one side to go around the blade, and so the air, because of Newton's laws, pushes back on the blade, giving it a nudge. And the shape of the blade therefore dictates which way you push the air, and therefore which way the air pushes back on you. And because it's easier to buy massive numbers of turbines that are made one way and made to rotate one way, then the convention is most people probably have them going in a certain direction. But different makers can make them so the blades are pointing in the other direction, so they'll just turn the other way. It won't make any difference, because on the back of those turbines is a big axle or a sort of central core which runs through into a dynamo or an alternator on the back, and it spins that through a gearbox and generates energy or electricity. Shouldn't say generates energy, naughty. It generates electricity, and that is then fed into the grid, and that goes through rectification and all kinds of systems to make sure it's in sync with the grid and at the right frequency and polarity and everything anyway. So it doesn't really matter which way they spin, it's the fact they're spinning and therefore extracting some energy from the moving air and turning it into electricity. That's what the important thing is.
Chris, I don't know if you saw the story of a tanning fanatic, Patricia Cantrell from New Jersey, who's addicted to tanning. I mean, Robbie said earlier that she now looks like a burnt piece of toast.
Dear.
I'll send you the picture. It's just absolutely incredible. Now, she has...
Has John Robbie got a good lawyer? I hope so. The Americans are a bit litigious, aren't they? That's naughty. I'm stereotyping American people and saying that they engage lawyers all the time. They wouldn't do a thing like that, I'm sure.
I mean, Chris, she is chocolate brown. I cannot describe. She looks like dark chocolate. And her hair is still blonde. You're laughing.
Do you think she's a natural blonde?
I I know the answer to that one. But anyway, Chris, she has a tanning booth at home, so that's why she's become like this. There's a big furore because she allowed her little girl, 6 years old, to spend some time in the tanning booth, and the teacher at school got concerned after the child came to school with burnt marks and so on, and called the police. Now, to cut a long story short, there's outrage over this, and she's being charged with child negligence. I've got a couple of questions stemming from that. I mean, that level of tanning, I want to know how these tanning beds or booths actually work. How are they different from the sun? And a child's exposure to something like this, I imagine that a child's skin would have a less resilience against whatever damage comes from this.
I think you're probably right on that latter count. But how do they work? Well, the answer is that they have UV lamps. So usually they use mercury, these lamps, and you put electricity in, and a bit like the strip light you have in your ceiling, you have mercury at a low pressure inside. The electricity excites the mercury atoms, and it makes them emit ultraviolet light. When you give energy to different atoms, then they give the energy back out at certain colours or wavelengths of light, and in the case of mercury it emits ultraviolet. And if you have a normal fluorescent light, then the glass is a white frosted colour, because that coating is a special what's called phosphor, and when the ultraviolet light hits it, it's then converted by these phosphors into a range of different coloured lights which when mixed together look white to us, and that's harmless. If you don't put the phosphor on the lamp and you have the right kind of glass, then the ultraviolet rays can come out from the lamp and they go into the air. And depending upon the wavelength of the ultraviolet rays, with longer ones going further and shorter ones going less far because they have more energy and interact with things sooner, you can therefore expose things to ultraviolet. And the way these tanning booths work is that they use an array of these tubes which are basically basting you in ultraviolet radiation. I'm not sure of the spectrum in terms of how much of the shorter and how much of the relatively longer wavelengths they use. But the bottom line is you're exposing your skin to ultraviolet rays, and the melanocytes, which are the cells in the skin that make melanin, the brown pigment, they have chemicals in them which can detect, in the same way that your eye detects visible light, they have chemicals called I think they use, is it melanopsin, or they have a rhodopsin-like chemical, the same colour as the same chemical that you use in the eye to turn light waves into electrical nerve signals. And so these cells can detect the presence of ultraviolet, and in response to that detection, they then trigger the gene which increases the production of melanin. So the cells make more melanin into the skin, and that makes you go brown. The problem is that before you go brown, if you haven't got a basal tan already, the dose that your skin sees of the ultraviolet can be quite high, and the ultraviolet rays are potentially able to damage DNA, because they have enough energy in the light waves that they can rip apart DNA molecules, and if you do that, then you can injure cells. And the important point here is that the energy going into the skin actually causes inflammation, and the reason you get sunburn is because the skin effectively becomes inflamed, and that's a localized inflammation response in the skin. It's the same effectively as having been burned with hot water. Very painful, of course, but potentially deleterious to your DNA. And young people are far more vulnerable than older people. And when I was in Australia, they're very aware of this, because of course half the Australian continent lies under this enormous hole in the ozone layer. And there was a headline in the newspaper that a friend of mine, who is a press officer for the SunSmart campaign in Australia, she wrote, and she said, you know, these sunbeds are an unregulated industry, and the power of the sunbed can be 5 times more intense than the noonday sun on an Australian beach. Now, Australia is a similar latitude to South Africa, so you know, if you read laying on the beach on the Eastern Cape on some of those lovely beaches, the input of UV that you could be seeing there, if you have pale skin and you're not protected by a good level of sunblock, is going to be maybe up to 5 times higher than you'd get from the sun. And so the potential damage and the aging effect on your skin is therefore going to be significantly higher. So it is a risk, and kids, I don't think, should go near these things. I think they're very bad news.
Sure, I'm definitely sending you this picture, Chris, and I want your response to it. Imagine dark chocolate, and I'm not exaggerating. Let's go to...
If anyone, I'll tell you what, just to tell you this, Reedy, that if anyone wants to see an interesting picture, look up man with Argyria, Argyria, Argyria. There's a picture of a bloke, I'm not kidding, he looks like a Smurf, you know, those blue cartoon characters. It was a gentleman, again in America, funnily enough, can't think why. He had this penchant for eating silver, and he was electrolyzing, he was putting silver into a solution and passing electricity into it to make the silver dissolve into the solution and then drinking it. And the silver has built up in his skin, because that's where the silver goes, and it's oxidized into this blue colour. And he's gone from a very normal looking person to this, he's blue, and he's permanently blue. So look him up, you can find his details if you type him into a search engine, I'm not kidding.
Addictions are a fascinating topic. I mean, what makes somebody just cross boundaries and go that far? Maybe that's a topic for another day. Charles in Rustenburg.
Hi, Rudy. Hi, Chris. Chris, I know that you've addressed the topic before of ozone use, and basically I think you only addressed breathing it in. The question I wanted to pose to you, there are practitioners around South Africa who are using ozone, 3% ozone, 97% oxygen, medical grade oxygen, and then putting it through the intravenously into people at about 2 milliliters per minute. And the base behind it all is curing viruses and bacteria, because it's an anaerobic environment that they grow in, and therefore they're now oxygenating it and killing it. And there are various stories of cures of AIDS and all sorts of things. I wanted to know from you whether this in fact could be true or not.
Hello, Charles. It sounds extremely dubious to me. Ozone is very, very poisonous. In fact, the water treatment people who are taking water from a reservoir and then putting it in a pipe to people's houses use ozone or chlorine because they are both oxidizing agents capable of killing microorganisms. And the reason they use them, and the reason that microorganisms are more vulnerable than we are, is because they're very tiny, and so the relative concentration of the ozone that they see in the water, or the chlorine, because they're working the same way, is effectively much higher, and it just destroys them. So were you exposed to a similarly high dose, it would oxidize your tissues. Oxygen is poisonous, and we just about survive at the right level here on Earth. If we have too much oxygen, then it becomes actually highly toxic, and it begins to form oxygen-free radicals, and it oxidizes your tissues, oxidizes your lipids and your DNA, and puts you on the path to cancer. So we can't live without oxygen, but too much of it's a bad thing too. And if you turn it into ozone, this is even more oxidizing and very reactive. And I think that there's no reason to think that it would benefit you having that intravenously. I can't think of a reason why. I certainly haven't seen any good quality clinical trials. And if it were that simple, being cheap as it is, I think Western medicine would have embraced that in every hospital in the world, because it would be the cheapest cure known to man. And the fact they don't do that says I don't think there's any good quality clinical evidence to support doing that. Sounds quite dangerous. But if anyone knows any information to the contrary, then please do send it to me. I'll be happy to review it.
Absolutely. Is it Kosi or Kosi in Bryanston? Kosi in Bryanston, hey?
It's Kosi.
Kosi, I beg your
guys.
pardon. Good morning.
Please, I'd like to just get that word that Chris said now about the guy with silver.
Oh, yes, it's Argyria. I'll tell you what I'll do. I will.
Think of Algeria.
I'll tweet it. No, not Algeria.
Yeah, but it sounds similar. Yeah.
If you follow us on Twitter, either Dr. Chris Smith or Naked Scientists on Twitter, I will tweet the link to this, and everyone can look at it. I'll do it just after the end of the show, so that if you follow now, I will tweet it to you all, and then you can get the link.
Excellent.
Okay, great. My question is around, because this is particular resonance with the question I want to ask, because it's about pica.
Pica?
I want to know, yes.
Okay.
I want to know what is the relationship between the particular type of pica and a particular physiological deficiency. And the reason I'm asking, pica is that craving for non-food stuff, is that I have a particular craving for the past at least 4 years for chalk. And I know that it's linked to iron deficiency, is what I've been told. But I've been taking iron tablets, and my iron levels have gone up because I'm a blood donor, so I get turned away many times because it's too low. I've recently taken tablets, and it's gone up, but the craving still remains. So what is in the particular craving? Because some people it's soil. Somebody said they inhale petrol from a, thing. Oh. So it's all different types of things. And okay. What is in that substance that you crave that links to any particular deficiency. And in my
Okay, all right, Kosi, I think we get the story.
Okay,
Chris?
Kosi. It's a very interesting question. The question of these pica, funny eating disorders or fads where you feel compelled to eat something. When she first said iron deficiency, I thought she might mention ice, because someone talked to us about a year ago here on 702 and said, why do I crunch ice? And then someone volunteered the association between crunching ice and iron deficiency, and we speculated that it might be because iron deficiency causes a sore mouth. It causes soreness at the corners of the mouth and on the tongue, glossitis, and maybe the ice makes that feel better. We don't know what causes these pica. There are certain disorders and developmental disorders which are associated with them, so that argues there's probably a cognitive element. But I also asked a gentleman called Peter Brennan, who is an expert on how the smell system works. He's at Bristol University in the UK. And I said to him, why is it that people, when they are pregnant, often claim that they develop cravings for certain foodstuffs? And he said it's interesting because what we think is going on is that the woman's body is making sure that it isn't deficient in a micronutrient, similar to what Corsi was arguing, and by giving you a craving for certain things, it's making you eat things that may contain the thing that is missing at a certain level in order to make up the shortfall. Whether that's really sustained by people wanting to, as they say they do, eat coal and things like that, because people claim to eat all kinds of things or get cravings for all kinds of weird things at various times. Whether that's actually supported by the evidence, I don't know, but that's the closest argument I came to explaining why people might develop these things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Kosi, and stay away from the chalk now. Let's go to Victor in Lyndhurst. Hi.
Hello, Rudy. How are you?
Fine, thank you. What is your question to the Naked Scientist?
I'd like to ask you if the composition of red blood is the same amongst all living things, like birds, animals, and humans.
That's very interesting, I think.
Hello, Victor.
Yes.
Well, all living things includes plants, and so plants don't have blood, obviously, but they do have they do have vessels in the plants. They have phloem vessels and xylem vessels, which carry water and salts and minerals and sugars and things around the plant. So plants do have a circulatory system. But in living animals, most animals have a pigment a bit like our hemoglobin in humans, the red stuff that carries oxygen around. Some animals have a different form of that. The horseshoe crab, for example, has hemocyanin, and this is a blue pigment. It's a beautiful bluey-green colour. So unlike our red blood, they have bluey-green blood. There are also some worms that live in the ocean, these annelids, and they have a pigment called hemethrin, which makes them the hippies of the sort of hemoglobin world, because their blood is a bright pink colour, sort of violet colour. Fantastic, so LSD blood. Then there's sort of us and insects and things like that. And when you squash various insects and things, you might occasionally see that they produce a little pool of red stuff. They have what's called a hemocoel. So they have a bag of fluids inside them that is a similar molecule to our hemoglobin with iron in it, which is why it's a red colour. So different animals have the same sort of problem to solve, how to get oxygen around their bodies. They do it by having a molecule a bit like hemoglobin, but they may not have iron in their hemoglobin. They may have some copper or another salt, which is why they get these different colours, but they basically work the same way. In terms of blood groups, humans have group A, group B, group O, and then group AB, depending upon what genes you have. We don't have the same blood groups as other animals, though. Other animals do have blood groups, dogs do, sheep do, but they're not the same blood groups as our blood, and you couldn't take a series of blood cells from, say, a dog and put them into a person. There would be a violent reaction, because the cells look very different to human cells, and so the immune system would reject them, but they basically work the same way.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you very much, Chris. We'll chat to you next week.
Brilliant. Thanks, Reedy. Thanks, everybody, and stand by for that tweet with Algeria Man coming up shortly.
Can't wait. Bye-bye.